Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm Father Nathan Castle, your host. Today, we're doing part 3 of 3 around the story of Buddy, who turned out to be the conductor. As perhaps you know, we use a story that has been told in either of my 2 Afterlife Interrupted books. This one is from book 1. We tell that story in one of the podcasts. In the follow-up, the second part, we look at that story through the lens of compassionate response. I get a lot of feedback, especially through email, through my website, from people who hear of one of these stories and it touches their heart, very often because they've been through something similar with someone they love. So compassion means to suffer with. And so very often people have invited me into the suffering that they're enduring because of the loss of a loved one. And I try to offer them supportive presence. You know, when we're grieving, we don't necessarily want another person to take our grief away. We just would like to be accompanied in it. And then if there are component parts of it where a grief counselor might be able to suggest another way of thinking, well, that's another matter. But I think it's important, first of all, to just be companion. Well, this third segment in the way that we have this structured is what I call spiritual practice, because I am a Catholic priest and have been a Christian and a practicing Catholic for my whole life. And I do believe that this tradition has things to offer people that are not a part of it, or maybe who were a part of it for a time and left it behind for one reason or another. You don't have to buy the entire package to benefit somehow from some of the component parts of the way we Catholic Christians do things. Today happens to be Good Friday, which I've always liked the fact that we call Good Friday good. It's the most horrific thing, the day that the Lord Jesus was crucified. But we have a kind of stubbornness about us that we can say, yeah, that's really bad, but let's look for the good. Where is good triumphing over evil? Where is light overcoming darkness, even when it seems darkest? I've always liked that kind of stubbornness. And at dark times in my own life, I've used that grace and said to Jesus, you're the one that's kind of the winner and still champion of overcoming horrific darkness. Would you help me through what I'm going through right now? That's one way I do it. Well, anyway, we're talking today about Buddy, who turned out to be the conductor, and some ways in which, if you're struggling in grief of some kind, ways in which this Catholic Christian tradition might give you some tools to work with. One thing I would start with is the idea that's pretty commonplace on tombstones and at conventional funeral services, whether they're churched or not. Rest in peace, RIP. Think of Halloween decorations of fake tombstones. They might not say anything on them except RIP, rest in peace. Well, that's a pretty universal wish on the part of survivors for people who have died. And sometimes we wish it so firmly that we carve it in stone. We engrave it into tombstones. We wish for you to rest in peace. So I would have you do this. Check your work. In your grieving, are you yourself not resting in peace? Are you agitated, not just because a loved one has died and perhaps died violently and suddenly, but are you entertaining ideas, thoughts that make your grieving worse because you're assuming that the person who has died must be in some torturous circumstance? I found that this can particularly be a temptation when people lose a loved one who has been disturbed for a period of time before their death, particularly parents that lose a child after some years of addiction and all the chaos and pain that comes with addiction. Sometimes people that are grieving the suicide of a loved one will assume that the same dramatic pain that accompanied their suicide must be with them ever after. I would just say, please remember the idea of wishing that our loved ones rest in peace. Don't jump to the conclusion that a person who died in an agitated state must be frozen in that agitated state. It's just not necessary to think that way, and it'll only make your grieving harder. To me, I sometimes refer to that as having dirt in the wound. It's a wound, losing a loved one, but it won't heal nearly as well if you have thoughts like that in it that kind of infect the grieving process. Try to allow yourself to imagine your loved one resting in peace, and imagine yourself resting in as much peace as you can muster. And for those of us who believe in a higher power, when you get to the limits of your own ability, that's not a bad thing necessarily. It just means you learn where your limits are, and then you ask for power beyond that. So I might say, God, I'm heartbroken over the loss of my loved one, and sometimes my heartbreak is bringing me into depression and is ruining my ability to stay in the present moment and be available to other people. Would you give me some of what you got? Would you give me sufficient peace for the day? You know, in the Lord's Prayer, we ask for our daily bread. We don't ask for a bakery or a lifetime supply of bread. We just say, would you give me today what I need in order to live this day well? And I would hold out for living it well rather than just say coping. I've never been much of a coper. To me, that just seems too low of a bar. I want to push myself to do better than cope. If that's all you can do, okay, maybe once in a while that's appropriate, but I would try to aim a little higher than that. So check your own work for whether you're resting in peace about your loved one's circumstance in the afterlife. Please don't assume that they're in some bad way. Even in this story, it's an odd thing to be told by Buddy that he was in the company of other people who had also died in collisions of vehicles and trains. But remember, they weren't being punished. They were just in a place that where they were stuck. But they weren't tortured. They were just aware of the fact that they were stuck. And they stayed that way for a time. He didn't mention having a care team that was working with him. Maybe he was incapable of that yet. I've been a counselor, and sometimes I've been invited to counsel someone who really wasn't ready to do the work of counseling, in which case best just to acknowledge the truth of that and say, I'll be here when you're ready, rather than waste each other's time. Well, if you have some reason to believe a loved one is not resting in peace, well, then can you peacefully ask that grace for them? I believe that our deceased loved ones hear us when we call out to them from our heart of hearts, however you do that. As a Catholic, I begin in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which involves placing a cross right over the heart. And from my heart, I then speak to my deceased loved ones and say hello. And I acknowledge I don't really know what you need or what I can provide, but I know that I love you. And I want you to know of my love for you. And I want you to know that it hasn't stopped because of your death. I wish the best for you, whatever that is. And I offer this prayer for you as a kind of energy, as a kind of resource that you might be able to use to the good somehow. I believe those prayers always get heard. Even if a person is unconscious, which sometimes happens in the afterlife, because being unconscious can be a way of resting. Think about being asleep. When we are asleep, we're unconscious, but our system is still operating. Our consciousness might be dormant during sleep, or at least uh, not operating the same way as it does during wakefulness. But if a person is not conscious in the afterlife and you pray for them, they'll get the message when they're awake. Very much reminds me of how sometimes when you visit someone in a hospital or nursing home, and at the time that you visit, they were asleep. Or sometimes you visit and they've been taken out of their room for some kind of treatment or something, and you have to leave a message. Well, I believe that when we pray, we're either heard in real time or the message that we want to convey to our deceased loved one is made available to them at the first available opportunity. So talk to your loved one and wish them well. One of the best things I think that we can do for our loved ones who have died is offer them blanket amnesty. If they had any reason to believe we're angry with them or unforgiving about something they said or did, can you just say with all your might, hey, I forgive you. Whatever it is that you might think that you did to hurt me, whether it's true or not, I forgive you. Now, you might not be able to finish the job in one fell swoop, but do the best you can. That's what I would advise. If you're able to say, let's bygones be bygones, one of these days, maybe we get caught up in when we're both in the afterlife and we have clarity and we figure out the problems that arose between us. But can you just say, hey, I don't want you to be worrying about anything involving me. I'd like for you to feel free to go on to other things. If you've got other people that you need to forgive or be forgiven by, that's not my business. But I want to clear the decks and let you know that you and I are good, at least for now. That's very helpful. And you might say that more than one time. You that might be something that you drive home, even if you never get any inkling that you're being heard. I just think that can be really very helpful. I forgive you, and I ask your forgiveness for any part that I had in any trouble that might have happened between us. Sometimes I've found that parents who lose a child, if there's been a divorce and somebody was only a part-time parent, they can feel that they let their child down and the child dies and that leaves a mess. So sometimes there's been that, or other times they were preoccupied with their own lives or their own troubles, or the person that the child that has died just was not reachable somehow. They might have tried their best and they could just never get through or never quite connect. You can just acknowledge the truth of that I wish things had been different for us, and I hope that one day they will be. And maybe they're on their way to that now. But for right now, could you just know that I love you and I'd like you to forgive me whatever you think you can forgive me, and I want you to know I'm forgiving you of everything that has passed between us that hurt me. That's really important. Um, it can be helpful in your imagination to think of your deceased loved one as having some reunions. Buddy wasn't in the company when we met him of people that he knew before. He didn't even mention the companion that was with him in the car. Maybe that person was someplace else, but he didn't mention being in the company of anybody that he knew already. Wasn't it sweet the way that he, when we asked for the piece of heavy equipment and the key and the operator to help run the thing. Well, first off, the operator didn't just take over, Buddy was put in the driver's seat. I just think that's the way the universe works. Our lives are ours to lead for the most part. We'll be helped to the degree that we need to be helped, but we all have a life to live, and so did Buddy. But then it wasn't very long before he said, "Wow, look at this! That rock! It's turning into light, and there's people inside of it, and there's my pawpaw, his grandfather." So that might have been the first loved one that he met after his death. The first person he knew who was who he knew loved him. I think that was the way it worked. And I asked him, "What, do you feel afraid?" "No, it's just my papa." And then he got busy and helped. He said his papa was waving at him to get everybody to hold hands, and before you knew it, Buddy was busy rescuing other people. Can you see this book right over here? It's the cover of it has these hands that are some are reaching down and some are coming up, and they're all different colors. I really liked that graphic because people are different from one another, but we're also the same. And we're all trying to help each other from above or below or right to left. Anyway, he did have a reunion when he was ready for it. And then the way he described it, I thought was really interesting too. When he got through this passage that we facilitated and that he facilitated, he said it was kind of like arriving somewhere after a long trip, but arriving late at night when it's you're tired and it's time for everybody to rest. There might be a moment where everybody's happy that you're here, great that you got here safely, can't wait to hear all about what you've been doing, but it's really time for us all to head towards bed. He then said that in the morning there'll be time for some rest, maybe something like breakfast, for me to be 2 cups of coffee, and maybe a gentle plan for the day that didn't involve a master plan, just some way of getting started. So can you imagine your loved one having some gentle, similar orientation towards their next life that doesn't have to do with violence and pain? That there's a next thing happening, but it doesn't all happen to happen at once. It might happen gently and at the pace that they are able to absorb. He said they treated me like I was a newbie because I was. They did need to treat me like I was just arriving, and there would have been need for some sort of orientation, but he was still tired and just waking to a day that had just gentle goodness in it, just some companionship, maybe some opportunities. He said that he met some people that he knew, including somebody that had died in his high school. Didn't sound like they were particularly close, but they were just easing him into um, reunions. I like that idea that everybody's capable of that. All of us have somebody that we cared about. So even somebody whose life just looked like a big mess, it seems to me on the other side that the universe, God, I would call it, Holy Spirit, would look for a way to help you kind of just get your feet under you, get oriented a bit, and maybe be back in the company of somebody that you are happy to be around. One of the things I liked about Buddy was there was nothing arrogant about him. He was on the other end of the scale. He was pretty quick to say, "I'm not the conductor, and I'm not really good at any one thing. I'm just kind of somebody that can figure things out." Um, he said, "I still don't know how all of this works, and I'm not much of a leader." Well, okay, I don't know how much all of this works either. And I don't know that in this lifetime I will know how it all works. You get to know some things and not other things. But um, but he did learn a truth that he was capable of leading. I made that point in the previous podcast that from now on, if there's ever a moment when he begins to backtrack and say, "I'm not much of a leader," now he has an experience of leading where he can say, "Except there was that one time when I turned out to be the conductor." I like that about life, is that you can decide a thing about yourself that is self-limiting and then have an experience that breaks through your limits. Have you ever done that? I can remember in childhood thinking that I didn't have a good singing voice. And maybe that was because in adolescence my voice cracked like everybody's does when they're going through puberty. I don't know. I just kind of created this idea that I didn't have a voice that was worth listening to. And then in my senior year of college, I was looking for an experience I'd never had, and the experience I'd never had was being a part of a musical group. I'd never been in a band, I'd never been in a choir, and never even like played an instrument with other people. I played the piano, but other than a random duet once in a while, that was pretty solitary. But my last year of college, I had enough leisure for it to take a few electives that would be just kind of for fun. And I looked at a class that was just called Chapel Choir, that was mostly music majors who were freshmen that were forced to take this prerequisite course. It was a church-related school, a Presbyterian school, and it had a formal Sunday service with a formal choir. And the choir was mostly comprised of young students just starting out in the music department. What business did I have there as a senior? But I just signed up for this class because I thought it just might be fun to be in a choir. I'd never done it. And I really did enjoy it. And one of the things I learned was that my voice is so low that that was the reason that I felt like I didn't have a good voice, was because most sung like church music or even songs you might try to sing along to on the radio are pitched higher than my natural voice. Well, what I learned is I have a deep bass voice. I can hit really low notes, but at the same time, I can't hit notes that are within the normal range of a lot of other people. So, okay, so I have a voice that's abnormal. That didn't mean bad, it just meant abnormal. If I were able to sing a part written for somebody that had a low voice like mine, I could do it really well. Or if I could solo sing in my own range, if I were able to set the key that the song I might sing was to be played or sung or in, I could do quite well. Well, I had to change my mind about something. I'm not bad at singing. I'm just bad at singing outside my range, and so is everybody else. Nobody sounds good when they're forced to sing uh, outside the range of what their voice can really accommodate. So anyway, I didn't mean to go into that at such length, but um, one of the things I enjoyed about Buddy was that he had a certitude about himself that he had to leave behind. He learned that he could be a leader, he could be the conductor, and the fact that people were pushing him toward it, that annoyed him. I'm not the conductor. I never said I was the conductor. Well, by the end of the story, he found that, well, at least in this one circumstance, I was the conductor, and I did have the necessary skills to help these people at that particular moment. So you might pray when you're praying for a loved one who has died, you might encourage in that way to be explorers. If they had any part of their personality that was reluctant to try a new thing, maybe you remind them of a time when, do you remember when you went off that high dive that you were so afraid of doing? Or uh, overcoming fear in this life or the next is a big deal. And if you have a love for someone who has died and you have any reason to believe that they might have died frightened of dying or in a fearsome way, or if you think that maybe they're afraid of something in the afterlife, I hope you don't overdo that. But you could always encourage. I love that word. It just means to, and means in, to put courage in. If you can think of pouring courage into the heart, and cor is the word for heart. If you can think of pouring courage in like a liquid into your loved one who has died, that'd be a good way to approach them in prayer and say, hey, I'm going to fill you up. I'd like to give you courage. And encouragement is something that we've all needed, and it's an expression of love. I can't think of what it would be like to love someone and never encourage them or never be encouraged by them. That just doesn't make any sense. He Buddy mentioned that he had been a passenger in his own life, and that's good to a point. Life does have beauties in it that don't need to be steered and controlled. But on the other hand, when you're praying for a loved one, uh, part of your encouragement might be to say, you know what, I saw this potential talent or interest in you that you never had the ability or the money or the time to do. If you want to do this, you could say, now that you're in the afterlife, and and if you use the word heaven, I do. If in fact that in my Father's house there are many dwelling places, that's the way Jesus put it. There are many opportunities and lots of um, possibilities and options. Maybe you encourage someone, you would have been really good at this or that that you never really got the opportunity to do. I'm wondering if you've given that any thought. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because that might at least be a way for you to get off of feeling guilty about your relationship with them or feeling frightened for them or something like that. Thinking encouraging thoughts and offering encouraging suggestions to someone who's died, that might be a good way to go. I'm going to conclude this with the way that I concluded the whole story. It seemed to me that in the story of Buddy, he thought of himself as no big deal. Even the way he talked about himself as kind of a jack of all trades, um, the way that I received the way he spoke of that was that it was no big deal to be a generalist, to be good or capable of doing a large variety of things, but not specializing in any one of them. He seemed to kind of downplay that like it would have been much better to hone in on one thing and be its expert. Reminds me of when you go off to college. When I was starting out in college, it just seems so important to be able to say what your major was. And most people declared one, the day they stepped on campus. I'm a this or that major. And I did that too, even though it was really half-hearted and not altogether true. I did end up being more of a generalist and loved the social sciences because they approached life and knowledge in a general way. And in my ministry, I've been a generalist much of my life, even though I specialized in campus ministry. But even there, I didn't want to get a PhD because I didn't want to have very, very specific knowledge of one thing. I wanted to know a smattering of stuff about lots of different things. And I chose an academic path that supported that. But anyway, Buddy thought that he was no big deal because he was kind of a generalist. Well, one of the things that occurred to me is that the universe is full of energy, and that's really what conductive material is good for. It conducts energy well. I used to live in Silicon Valley where, somebody discovered these silicon chips were good at conducting energy that runs computers like the one I'm using to do this podcast. Well, Buddy learned that he was good conductive material. He wouldn't have used religious language to describe it necessarily, but he was the conductor that was needed at the time. And some kind of goodness flowed through him. We asked God to send the heavy equipment. He's the one that asked for the key. It was his pawpaw that showed up to help run the thing. He did organize people and get them to join hands and all pull through together. He ended up being quite a big deal just by being who he was. So if you're praying for someone who might have had thwarted hopes or a life of disappointment or something like that, don't necessarily think that that's the story that's written about them and that's all they'll ever be. You might encourage them to leave behind any sadness, regrets, and turn towards opportunity, and you support them that way in your prayer. You might even find that it's better to pray for this kind of thing in the morning or in the midday. Any way you look at it, death it has a sadness about it, and I try not to pray about sad things at night before I go to sleep. As you know, my sleep is already full of people showing up with often violent death stories. So the last thing I need is to fill my imagination full of sad or frustrating thoughts right before sleep. If I'm going to pray about anything like that that has a kind of problematic involved in it, I'd rather do that in the bright light of the morning or in the midday. So when you do pray for people that have died a violent death or that you're grieving, I recommend that prayer to be in the morning or in the midday, maybe outdoors in the presence of plant life and flowers or bird song or natural beauty, whatever you can manage outdoors. I'd recommend that too. Well, that's about enough for right now. That's the story of Buddy, who turned out to be the conductor. We can all turn out to be something that we haven't been yet. And I hope that whatever is percolating in you that could become the next big thing in you or the next great thing that you have to offer the universe, I want to pray in support of that. So I bless you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit and say, so long for now. Thanks for being with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Joyful Friar. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can make a donation by clicking the donate button. See you next time.